Good afternoon. I first want to thank the sponsors for organizing this important conference and to everyone who took the time to be here to discuss the significant matter of the Jewish refugees from the Arab countries. It's my hope that through the exchange of ideas, we can find ways to keep moving this issue forward to a successful resolution. As a member of the U.S. Congress, I feel a personal and professional responsibility to protect the Jewish community, to support a secure and prosperous Jewish state, and to ensure that Jews are never again subjected to the persecution, violence, and racism that has marred so much of our history, especially in the last century. An issue of particular importance, therefore, is the entirely unresolved issue of the Jewish refugees from the Middle East. For more than 2,500 years, the lands of the Mediterranean and the Middle East have been home to large and vibrant Jewish communities. And for generations and generations, these communities contributed to their nations like any other, while simultaneously maintaining and supporting their own Jewish identities and Jewish institutions. Periods of prosperity and relative tolerance alternated with periods of less tolerance and of persecution. But the Jews' status as permanent residents and members of the polity were never abrogated. Following the creation of Israel in 1948, however, the status of Jews in Arab and Muslim countries changed dramatically. When virtually all of the neighboring countries declared war on the nascent Jewish state pursuant to a specific decree of the Arab League, many Jews in these countries were forcibly expelled and forced out. Jews were either uprooted from their countries of birth or became subjugated political hostages in the Arab world's conflict with Israel. Approximately 850,000 Jews were forced from their homes in the various Arab countries. In virtually all cases, individual and communal properties were seized or confiscated by governments without any compensation. The 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees, which decrees the international definition of a refugee, clearly applies to Jews who were expelled and some who fled from persecution in the Middle Eastern countries. That convention reads, a refugee is a person who, quote, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable to, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country, close quote. How many Jews who fled from Egypt or Libya or Iraq or Syria would willingly subject themselves to the protection of that country? And on two separate occasions, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees ruled that Jews fleeing Arab countries were bona fide refugees who fall within the mandate of that UN office. Despite these facts, there has been virtually no international response to the issues of the hundreds of thousands of Jews who were expelled and forced out of the Arab countries. We've heard already today that of the 1,088 United Nations General Assembly and Security Council resolutions on the Middle East conflict adopted between 1947 and 2010, not one contains any specific reference to these hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees. 172, by contrast, refer directly and exclusively to the plight of the Palestinian refugees. It is simply wrong to recognize and deal with the plight, with the rights of Palestinian refugees without recognizing the rights of Jewish refugees, many of whom suffered terrible outrages at the hands of their former compatriots. One reason for this disparity, of course, is the difference in the histories of these two refugee populations. The Jewish refugees mostly went to Israel, where they were welcomed, absorbed, and integrated into the society and the economy, and today constitute a large part and even a majority of the Israeli population. The Palestinians, by contrast, were mostly denied access to citizenship in the host countries that they entered, denied participation in the local economies, and kept in camps where they were denied basic rights and maintained at UN and international expense. The stated goal of this policy was to use the refugees as a weapon against acceptance of the State of Israel. And people should be reminded of the many declarations by the Arab League and by Arab League officials that any Arab country that permitted the resettlement and absorption of Palestinian refugees would be committing treason to the high goal of destroying Israel. As time passes and as the international community and Israel's neighbors continue to ignore the history of nearly 1 million Jews, the injustice of the situation becomes more and more intolerable. Thankfully, the issue is becoming more widely known within political circles in the United States and around the world, beginning to be. and more people understand that the suffering and terrible injustices visited upon the Jewish refugees need to be acknowledged and redressed. This is in part thanks to the recent efforts of the Israeli government through events like this conference and its recently announced plans to have a national day of recognition of Jewish refugees. Palestinian officials and Arab media have taken notice, a recognition which, even if hostile at this point, and it is hostile, represents a positive step forward, that they even notice it. On my part, I've worked for the past several years in the U.S. Congress to ensure that the U.S. government acknowledges this issue and actively seeks to obtain justice from the international community. As you have heard, in 2008, the House of Representatives passed my bipartisan resolution recognizing the history of the Jewish refugees. This resolution urged the international community to consider all refugees equally when discussing Middle East refugee matters. It urged the President, it can only urge the President because the President under the U.S. system has foreign policy authority. It urged the President to instruct U.S. representatives to the United Nations and other international bodies and to any negotiations regarding a peace settlement in the Middle East to make certain that references to the Palestinian refugees are matched by equivalent references to Jewish, Christian, and other refugees displaced from Arab countries, and to insist that any compensation agreed to for Palestinian refugees be matched by exactly equivalent compensation to Jewish refugees. This past July, I introduced a bipartisan bill in the House, and there's now a companion bill in the Senate, designed to secure equal treatment of Palestinian and Jewish refugees. It would also recognize Christian and other displaced population. The bill reiterates the resolution in encouraging the U.S. President and representatives of the administration when speaking on the issue of Middle Eastern refugees at international forums to pair any explicit reference to Palestinian refugees with similar reference to Jewish and other refugee populations. The bill restates the key facts concerning the hundreds of thousands of refugees forced from Arab countries. It requires, it doesn't urge, it requires a periodic report from the President detailing the efforts of the executive branch to carry out the mandate of the 2008 resolution, and detailing any assistance the United States has provided on the issue of Jewish refugees and recommendations on how to ensure equal consideration of all refugees in any final Middle East peace agreement. I believe, as I believe everyone here does, that the fair and equitable treatment of Jewish refugees, that raising the issue is essential, not only for redress and for justice, for tzedek, but also as part of a counter, as we've heard before, to efforts to delegitimize Israel, to counter that the creation of Israel was the Nakba, or the UN resolution in 1947 was the Nakba, that there was a catastrophe for Palestinians, and that's what we have to deal with. As Professor Kotler said last night, that's a slightly distorted version of history, and this can help us undistort it. I want to thank both B'nai B'rith International, its Director of Legislative Affairs, Eric Fussfield, as well as Justice for Jews from Arab Countries and its Director, Stan Ehrman, for their help in preparing and advocating for the 2008 resolution and for the current bill. I know Dr. Ehrman is here with us, continuing his hard work on this issue. This important legislation has real momentum behind it. Besides being bipartisan, it is supported by the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Congresswoman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, who's one of the co-sponsors. Unfortunately, as some of you may know, the 112th Congress is rapidly coming to a close. We may simply run out of time this year to pass the bill. If that happens, we will reintroduce it in the next Congress in January and continue to push it until we get it through. And I have high hopes that we will, in fact, get it through. Those of us who care about this issue have certainly made progress in increasing awareness both in the U.S. and around the world. We must continue this effort, making clear that we will not retreat from confronting the obvious injustice of these Jewish refugees and the imbalance with which the refugee issue has so far been considered. Standing steadfast and continuing to insist that the rights of all refugees must be considered equally and fairly, especially in any final peace agreement, is the only moral way forward. I look forward to working with fellow members of Congress, with Israeli officials, with Jewish organizations, and interested persons, that is, persons interested in justice from around the world, in any way I can to see that recognition is achieved and justice done for Jewish refugees.